Well, hello there, and today we are doing another GeoGuessr tier list, and this time we are looking at North, Central, and South America. Before we jump straight into this, all countries that do not have official coverage in any shape or form have been put in I don't know, Jeff. And if there are any countries in this tier list that don't have enough information to review, they will also be put in this category. Rightio, let's just jump straight into it. And the very first territory or country is actually the US Virgin Islands. So the US Virgin Islands is a very nice round to get on GeoGuessr, mostly because of the Google car. The Google car is very distinct. It's like you see the front of some sort of truck. It is either red or white, and also the shape of the truck can vary. There's like a version of like a pumpkin shaped truck which can like rule out one of the islands, so it definitely is one of the easiest, especially based on it being islands. It's very easy to get points, so yeah, it's a no-brainer to have US Virgin Islands up there. The next one on the list is Costa Rica. So Costa Rica only has official trekker coverage. That may change in the future, but for the time being, most of its coverage is within its capital. And you can get some coastal trekkers, but they are mostly on the west coast, so it's quite easy to get points in Costa Rica. The third country on the list is the Dominican Republic. It has a very distinctive Google car. It has rubber racks. No other country in the Americas has. The third territory or country, I think it belongs to the Netherlands, but it is Curacao. So Curacao, very small island, but it is very gettable. So you've also got racks in this country, but you do not have the rubber racks. Another thing is you have a black cat at the front, which you do not get in any other country in the Americas besides ones that do not have racks. So Curacao is quite a nice country to identify. The final one I have put here is Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico it has a unique meta where it has like a long antenna to the side, but there is always that risk of going very wrong with Puerto Rico because you can get the same kind of meta in Guam and North Mariana Islands on the complete opposite side of the world. But there are other clues around that you can use to confirm it's Puerto Rico, especially not seeing front plates all the time is a very good indication. And it's a very small island, probably bigger than the other ones, but you're still going to get a lot of guaranteed points when you have Puerto Rico. Okay, so now we're moving on to It'll Do, Jeff, and the first country we had is Uruguay. Probably one of the smaller countries in South America, especially with official Street View. It's quite a nice round to get. You've got some very distinctive areas like mountainous areas towards the east or the far north. You also get Montevideo, which is like the only real proper main city in Uruguay. And yeah, it can also be distinctive when you're alongside the river that separates Uruguay from Argentina, so it is quite a nice country to get, and you're going to get a fair amount of points on it. The next country, and the final country in It'll Do, Jeff, is Guatemala. Like I said before, with Curacao and Dominican Republic, you can get racks. The difference is that Guatemala will have like a grey stroke silverish car, unlike the Curacao one, which will be black, and it won't have the rubber racks. So that's a good way to separate it from those two. Moving on to No Thanks Chief, we have Bolivia. So Bolivia is quite a fairly decent sized country. Not as big as people think it is, but it's still fairly large. But the main thing that stands out with Bolivia over the other South American countries is it has a lack of coverage. So you can really narrow it down quite quickly, especially if you study Bolivia. You can still muddle it up with like a Chile and Peru because of the white Google card. The flat green areas in Bolivia are quite easy to region guess. And also if you study more of like the differences within Bolivia's desert-like environments, it's quite handy too. I haven't really done that as much, but I've learnt a few things recently, so I have to put it higher up compared to the other bigger South American countries. The next country I've put is Ecuador. So Ecuador is quite a small country for South America, but there hasn't really been much study on region guessing in Ecuador. I mean, I've found my own findings recently, which would be great when I share it to you guys in the future. And there are quite a few clues that you can use that can help you. But even then, there's not many. But because of the country size, it should be fairly easy to identify, especially with the grey kind of like brick buildings are pretty much everywhere. And the terrain variation, especially towards the coast, is quite distinctive. So Ecuador has to be under No Thanks Chief. And the final country I've put in No Thanks Chief is Chile. Although it's like probably like an average sized country for South America, it is a very, very long one. So country size was one of the factors I based. If I did something like the country width and length, maybe then Chile might be under if buts and maybes, but in this instance it is no thanks Chief, and it has a lot of environmental variation anyway. So like when you go to the far north, it appears more desert-like, very white, proper sandy desert. Then as you work your way down, you get more of a rocky kind of deserty environment. Then you reach Santiago, and Santiago is quite distinguishable. And then eventually, when you start going further south, it starts to get green towards like Puerto Montt, Temuco, and so on. And then it gets more mountainous again towards the really far south, and that is more like almost tundra-like environment. So Chile can be really narrowed down quite quickly if you study it. And for me, I feel fairly okay with Chile. I struggle mostly with where the coverage is far down south, but also working out how far north in Chile can be difficult at times as well. Okay, so before we jump into if, buts and maybes, I'm going to mention a territory island, that actually has a visual street view, but it is very limited and it's trekker only. And that is Martinique. So Martinique, I think it belongs to France. Correct me if I'm wrong down below. I don't want to make any mistakes. But I very rarely got this in GeoGuessr. It can happen. I did get it in a battle royale one time, which was quite funny. But I don't really have as much knowledge of where the coverage is either. If we're being realistic, if I get Martinique, obviously I'm going to find it incredibly difficult. I'll probably go to the other side of the world. Okay, so for the first country, if, buts and maybes, might surprise a few, but it is actually Argentina. So Argentina is a very long and big country, and of course in the World Cup final, as I'm speaking, I wonder if they've won it. Maybe they have, maybe they've not. But Argentina can be quite nice. Its mountainous areas to the west can be quite distinct. Its grasslands towards the north, especially where there's palm, can be quite handy. You've obviously got the Panhandle, but the Panhandle is only like a very small part of Argentina. The main cities can be distinguishable, and then obviously really far south can be very distinguishable as well. But kind of between that, where it starts getting like more cold and south, that's where I struggle the most, and I think that's where most people struggle actually, is kind of that kind of middle of nowhere kind of. It's not quite tundra yet, but it's also not like a warm desert at the same time. That area is a bit of a mix. So Argentina, you can also muddle it up with Peru sometimes. It does happen. So, and Uruguay to that extent, but it doesn't really happen as much nowadays. So it have to be under if, buts and maybes. The next country I put is the very first North American country, and it is Canada. So Canada is a fairly big country, one of the biggest in the world, of course. Urban-wise, it can be quite a nice country to get, but if you think about how big Canada is, as well as that, you also have to think of the Arctic territories, and I'm terrible at, Arctic territories in North America. So I have to put that into account, and if, buts and maybes makes sense, and there's a lot of Canada like provinces that can kind of get muddled up. So Canada has to be under if, buts and maybes. It's definitely one of the hardest countries here, but we can move on to its neighbouring, I guess call it friend, USA. And the USA, it's a similar story, but I find it more difficult to identify individual states over identifying individual provinces. So USA has to be harder just based on that fact. You've also got Alaska, you've also got the Hawaiian Islands. That can be quite tricky to, for me at least, to like separate between them or identify which island we're on. And it's a big country. Well, okay, so now we've reached the final category, which is raw quiche and Araska. Surprisingly, there is 4 countries here. So I think it's the first time we've had more than 2 or something. I don't remember, but this is the first time we've had like 4 definitely in the tier list series so far in raw quiche and Araska. And I feel like they are justified enough to be in there. And the very first country I've got is the final one in North America, and that is Mexico. Mexico is a very big country. It's quite a big country. It's quite long as well, and it's a similar story to the US, but probably harder with identifying the correct states. So Mexico has to be under there. I think its only exception, I guess, is Yucatan can look quite distinctive. Same with Quintana Roo. Of course, the capital city Hedge does wonders, but the fact is, I'm not great with Mexican state ID. I can work out whether it's further north, whether it's towards the middle, whether it's more towards the west coast or the east coast, or towards like the Yucatan or the Gulf. So it has to be under raw quiche and a rice cake. I need to study it more, so hopefully my Mexico knowledge gets better over time. The next country I've put may surprise a lot, and it's Colombia. And people might be saying, Colombia, it's not that big. And I tend to get points fairly often. But the thing is, Colombia is much bigger than you think it is. I think Peru was like 1.2 million kilometers in area, whereas like Colombia was like 1.1 or 1 or just 1 mil. So that's not much difference. That is not a big difference in my books. So if people think Peru is big, they need to think twice when they think about Colombia as well. It's just because it's on the equator, it looks a lot smaller than it does. So with Colombia, region guessing can be a nightmare. I think you can identify cities if you put enough practice in. I haven't, but it's like working out whether you're towards the north parts of Colombia, the northern cities, or more towards the far south ones, towards Ecuador. The far south ones are a nightmare. They're the worst ones because most of the time you want to go near Bogota or Medellin, and if it's really dry, you've obviously got the region guessing far north, and then you've obviously got the regional guessing for east of the Andes. So it can be narrowed down quite a bit, Colombia. But a generic looking Colombia round is probably one of the worst rounds you can get in GeoGuessr if you're playing solo wise. Team duels wise, it's not as big, it's not as much of a big deal. But I'm looking at this from an independent viewpoint, and as an independent guess or a solo guess in Colombia, I feel like it has to be one of the highest in the game. It's interesting that it's actually statistically higher, or I don't remember if it's higher the same, but it's pretty much slightly higher than Mexico for some reason. So actually, I've checked my table and it should actually be behind Mexico. Okay, so the second last country, I mean, I think you guys can work out which one's going to be the hardest, but the next one is Peru. There is environmental variation, but it's that kind of the way the environment is, so like spread around the country. So like it's more like done in like a thick kind of like crescent of some sort. So like you got the Amazon, and then you've got the mountainous areas, and you've got the very mountainous areas, and then you've got the coastal areas. And the coastal areas go all the way up from that south to north, same with all the other environments. So region guessing wise, it can be a nightmare. And if you actually go off like province or region guessing, it's probably going to be even harder than Mexico. So, I mean, that's probably because of my lack of knowledge on them. But even then, it's probably going to be a nightmare. But I've been getting better at Peru recently. I definitely think Peru is the most underlooked country in GeoGuessr. I'll say that now. I feel like there is potential to get findings in Peru, especially when more Generation 4 coverage comes out. This may change in the future, and I'm always going to keep an eye out on things that stand out in Peru that I could use for my advantage. But yeah, it's the second hardest one on this tier list for sure, and the final one we have is Brazil. I don't really say much of Brazil. It's a very big country, not really much variation. When you are more confident in Brazil, it's mostly because you've put that much work in that it's going to be easier. But realistically, even with that, you'll probably still find it harder in all these countries on this tier list. I've been getting better at Brazil, but there's so many better players than me now in GeoGuessr in general, but also at Brazil, and I feel like I need to spend more time in Brazil to get better at it again. But other than that, the next final tier list video will be all the countries for GeoGuessr, and I might fancy doing something else these tier lists in the future as well, just for the fun of it. But yep, I'll see you next time. Yeah, of course.